to introduce Adrienne Brown, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literatures. She specializes in American and African American cultural production in the 20th century and is exploring the influence of architecture and urban planning on literary form, alongside the ways that narrative intervenes in our historical and experiential understandings of space. Adrienne's work also considers a range of objects beyond the literary, considering the way TV shows hear, journalists see, and class may be felt, and analyzing race's sonic and spatial dimensions. She's working on a book recovering the skyscraper's central role in structuring American social and aesthetic perception in the early 20th century, and how it transformed modernity's modes of seeing. She'll be speaking today on Appraisal as Perception, Seeing the Mid-Century Block with Gwendolyn Brooks and Jamie James. Let's welcome her.
Good morning. I'm so happy to be here. I'm a little sick, so sorry if I sound a little nasally. I have to take some sneeze breaks, but hopefully you can hear me and I'm not too in my nasal cavity. So I thought I'd begin first by kind of situating what I'm going to deliver today in relation to the skyscraper project that Elizabeth just mentioned, and what it's kind of moving toward, just to give you some context for this work. So I just finished my book called The Black Skyscraper, Architecture and the Perception of Race. And in that book, I consider how a range of figures at the turn of the century, architects, painters, writers, etc., laborers, imagine a skyscraper to potentially negate or muddle race as something to be read or experienced by one's own body. So in this book, I'm thinking about how Americans grappled with the question of how race was to be read or might endure as a meaningful category in cities in which bodies were hard to see and therefore know, be it from the top floor of the skyscraper where everyone looks like those dark specks. You get this kind of analogy. I mean, that's a common analogy today, and specks, that you can't really make out bodies, to the crowded streets at its feet, where you have all the density created by the skyscrapers that are creating similar kinds of problems for knowledge and how do you know a body, how do you identify somebody, which in this period that I'm interested in between 1880 and 1931, we have the one-drop rule being ratified, you have the Supreme Court saying that race is what the common man can see, you have these kind of competing definitions of race. So I'm really interested in the way the skyscraper complicates this question of what it means to see race, and the way that writers themselves, and writers in this very capacious way, were thinking and noting the skyscraper as this architecture that was changing perceptual practices, particularly around race. And in pursuing this story about the skyscraper, I make the case for thinking how architecture more broadly always shapes the perceptual life of race. So this kind of test case to make this larger claim that for attending to architecture as it produces the material conditions through which racial signs appear. So that, and that's really the kind of large claim of this book, that we have to think about architecture as it creates the conditions through which people have an experience of race. So trying to bring together critical race theory and architectural history together. So that's the book I'm just finishing. And so in the second project, I'm pivoting from architecture, really at the turn of the century, to real estate in the mid-20th century. So in the epilogue to the skyscraper book, I argue that one afterlife of this story of the early skyscraper is in the invention of the mass suburbs at mid-20th century, which I argue helps to kind of rescue the category of whiteness from urban spaces that had threatened to erode its distinctiveness. The kind of system set up to prop up home ownership in the U.S., but also the kind of lower density of the suburbs, kind of take some of the visual pressure off of whiteness in particular that I very much tracked in the first book. And so this story, this emerging story about real estate and home ownership in the mid-century, is at the heart of this new project, tentatively titled, this is not going to be the final title, but this is a placeholder title, Residential Aesthetics from the Rep Party to the Fair Housing Act. And there I focus on how America's transition to becoming a nation of homeowners for the first time in the 20th century also remade categories of description and affect, particularly in relation to race. So the move to mass homeownership in the 20th century, which is perpetuated by new financial mechanisms like the 30-year mortgage, which is invented after the Great Depression. So this idea of this kind of amortized long-term debt, redlining as a policy, but also a set of perceptual practices, like what are you going to do to kind of adjudicate, see race. I'll talk a little bit about that today, as well as the birth of new sciences like appraisal and land use economics, which in some ways were extensions or had their origins in race science from the 19th century. So think about all these kind of different aspects of home ownership, real estate, and property that altered how Americans experienced the neighborhood as a social, spatial, and a racialized unit. And so this talk today really comes from this new project and is focused on this question of valuation and appraisal. Okay, so with that, I think I'll just start after I take some tea. All right. So, residential integration was a recurring topic of interest within mid-century literature. Can everybody see? Okay. While not quite reaching the status of a standalone genre, novels and plays and poems and children's books written about the travails of communities when blacks moved onto white blocks were a persistent part of the literary landscape between the end of World War II and the 1968 passage of the Fair Housing Act. Of these works, and this is just a kind of smattering of some of them, Lorraine Hansberry's Raising the Sun maintains the broadest audience today. But Hansberry's play belongs to a cohort of works written by blacks and whites, now mostly out of print, attempting to turn residential integration into a story of mass consumption. Starting with Maxine Woods' 1946 Broadway play On Whitman Avenue, depicting the deleterious effects of prejudice upon black and white neighbors alike, the theme of residential integration was taken up by naturalist novels like Milton Brand and William Manchester, and Frank London Brown's 1959 Trumbull Park, fictionalizing the riots in Chicago, following the real riots in Chicago, following the integration of a public housing complex, and the suburban integration melodramas First Family, Peaceable Aid, and No Down Payment, which all come out between 1957 and 1960. So this literature really spans the suburbs, but it's also urban literature too when you're thinking about urban residential neighborhoods. It takes a different form in the suburbs, but it's really a kind of drama of residential integration is a city question as much as it is a suburban question, at least in the 50s and the 60s. So much of this literature could be classified as social issue fiction, or akin to what James Baldwin referred to as the protest novel, works whose quote, this is from Baldwin, power as a corrective social force were insufficient to override its deficiencies as literature. And one of the novels he talks about when he's talking about this kind of bad protest fiction is one of these integration novels by Milton Brand. Baldwin insists that protest fiction, by standardizing the experience of both race, what it means to see race, and also the kind of experience of racism as a force, cause readers to tune out rather than attend more meaningly to these phenomena. And this is from Baldwin, quote, the very frequency and sameness of the of these reports operate on the public mind as a bludgeon, numbing the hypothetical response. So he's kind of this dig of calling this literature reports instead of fiction. Baldwin's claim about protest fiction's shortcomings apply to much of the post-war literature of residential integration. Such works, generally realist and liberal in nature, veer toward the didactic. Good white liberals are distinguished from their more openly racist neighbors by their internal struggle over whether to accept the dip in their property value or to quickly sell. Black characters are either unhesitatingly noble heroes or emotionally stunted types whose desire for integration is driven by pride and elitism. And that's not true of all of these texts. That's not true of something like Raisins in the Sun, but it is kind of true of many of these integration novels and plays. Reviewers found these texts aesthetically wanting in their, quote, contrived plots and flat prose, and politically weak in their apologetic hand-wringing. And given that these works quickly disappeared from the literary landscape, most critics and readers shared Baldwin's sense that these novels offered little beyond the surface polemic, making them ineffectual as dissent and art. The aesthetic shortcomings of much of this literature, as noted by Baldwin and others, however, has obscured the extent to which residential integration has overdetermined the story of housing and race in mid-century, even as these individual works of fiction have faded from cultural memory. The trope of the brave African-American family integrating a neighborhood of full mixed white homeowners, as seen perhaps best visually encapsulated by Norman Rockwell's iconic 1967 illustration, New Kids in the Neighborhood, still endures as a prevailing sign of residential segregation's overcoming at mid-century. But despite the frequent representations of showdowns between white neighborhoods and pioneering black residents, tense encounters between such families attempting to live next to one another was not the only or even the most common story of race in housing at mid-century. Though residential integration harbored ready-made intrigue for novelists and playwrights, its occurrence was a blip within the relatively steady state of segregation characterizing most mid-century U.S. neighborhoods. So even when you have moments like this one that, like moments like this one that Rockwell is painting, in neighborhoods, say on like Chicago's South Side, you'd have this encounter, but neighborhoods would change over in 18 months to 2 years. So you have this blip of integration that actually kind of made way for segregation once again. So although undoubtedly bolstered by individual acts of racial discrimination, the maintenance of residential segregation depended upon a matrix of financing decisions, government interventions, and codes of ethics enforced by a multiracial alliance of realtors, appraisers, landlords, developers, bureaucrats, and bakers working to depersonalize the profitable business of segregation. So while you have fiction writers really kind of glomming onto this version of integration, this kind of quieter story of maintaining segregation that's done in banking offices and the Federal Housing Administration's mapping centers. You don't really have novels about that, right? How do you tell that story? Which is actually a kind of more common story, or the more enduring story. While fiction about residential integration describes what happens when mechanisms of residential segregation fail, a range of comparatively unspectacular narrative forms from the period capture the more impersonal processes of observation used to generally uphold residential apartheid. More precisely, it is within the expanded category of the report that James Baldwin dismisses when he calls protest fiction reports. It's in that category of the report where we find writers attempting to account for race rather than lament the fact of racism. Such texts, rarely urgent or revelatory, or a good or fun read, focus on the mechanics of how race was seen, appraised, and categorized, dwelling in the more nebulous moment of racial sight rather than the dramatic scene of encounter following the crystallization of racial knowledge. When Baldwin collapses protest fiction into the category of the report, he intends this as a denigrating demotion of literature. He faults for sacrificing aesthetics to polemics, so he really means it as this nasty dig. But rather than understanding the expansion of the category of the report as a contraction of the aesthetic, which is what Baldwin means, we might instead think of the report as expanding how and where we find the aesthetic, helping to make visible the imaginative acts of narrativization, undergirding more documentary material. So I'm really interested in claiming this category of the report as doing more capacious work than the work of fiction. And we get to kind of think of all these other different kinds of narrative forms under the category of the report that are creating stories of race just as much as fiction is. So I want to turn our focus then from fictions of residential integration that really circle around acts of confrontation, so like this confrontation encounter, like the one in the Rockwell painting, to instead something I'm calling the literature of residential segregation, rooted in descriptive processes of appraisal. So this category encompasses literary fiction, but also includes documents, forms, manuals, textbooks, manifestos, reportage, and maps used to assess, maintain, and at times question the intertwined protocols for perceiving and valuing racial difference. That goes into propping up the mechanisms of residential segregation. Though appraisal can refer to the act of assessing either people, goods, or property, these modes of assessment proved deeply entangled at mid-century and way before mid-century, given the linkages between a property's market value and the racial makeup of its surrounding neighborhood. The literature of appraisal thusly encompasses materials emerging from a professional appraisal, which I'll look at in the second part of this paper, but also broader modes of urban observation, exploring the methods for and the utility of looking closely. The story of how speculative systems of racial appraisal and real estate appraisal shaped one another is not just one for economists, historians, and urbanists to tell. It is also fundamentally a story of perception, which I think is also a story of aesthetics, how race is materially experienced in light of what George Lipsitz describes as the possessive investment in whiteness reaffirmed through systems storing up home ownership. So what follows, I want to the first part of this will track the changing language of appraisal from the 1920s to the 1960s, particularly as it appears in appraisal manuals designed to train professionals in the act of observation. So we'll walk through a couple of these manuals and close read the language they give to train people to how do you appraise a neighborhood, particularly around the question of race, which was the foremost factor in appraisal in the mid-century. And I think still today, if the language is not encoded in these manuals in the same way today. And then in the last part, I'll turn to the mid-century text by Jane Jacobs and Gwendolyn Brooks, which I think was circulated in order to claim them as writing versions of appraisal manuals of a different kind, as these writers conducted their own experiments in how to see and consequently value buildings and bodies in relation to one another. Okay, part 2. While property appraisal first emerged as a discrete discipline in the US at the turn of the 20th century, it most fully began to come of age as a profession and an academic area of study in the 1920s. Appraisers were aware of the importance of race to both the selling and the valuation of homes quite early within the discipline's history. Frederick Babcock, who would write the first underwriting manual for the Federal Housing Authority, also known as the FHA, in the 1930s, norming previously localized practices, was the first to suggest in print that appraisers attend to social influences when valuing a property. So before he joined the FHA, Babcock penned the 1924 manual called The Appraisal of Real Estate, generally credited as the first document to formalize racist function and valuation. So Babcock would bring these methods with him to the FHA, and instructing valuators appraising homes for federally backed mortgages to, and this is the language from the first FHA underwriting manual from 1936, quote, investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. David Rudiger has done a really kind of amazing job of marking how the social part of this really falls out when you're looking at actual covenants and maps, and that race really becomes the sign or the most important factor. And for Rudiger, importantly for him, there's no such thing as something like an ethnic difference before 1960. Those were all called racial differences, and that the category of ethnicity is really invented much later than the time period we tend to use the term ethnic versus racial difference. Okay, so these rules are these are not the first time that these rules have been uttered or have been enforced, but it's the first time we see them written down, and they're the first time they're written down in a federal document. This is 1936, where the FHA is really starting to begin to offer home insurance mortgage insurance, right? So if you wanted to get mortgage insurance, right, you had to meet these criteria. And even if you weren't getting mortgage insurance from the federal government, most private lenders followed the FHA standards. So the FHA standards really, even if your home wasn't FHA insured, it was really setting the tone for lending across the nation. So historians like Carl Nightingale, David Freund, Kenneth Jackson, and others have marked the importance of forms and classificatory documents produced by the Federal Housing Administration and the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, for the collection of racial data. And yet, we know relatively little about the actual procedures that appraisers undertook when doing this collecting. So the report evaluator form issued by the FHA asked appraisers to mark, in addition to details about a home's physical properties, the presence of inharmonious racial and social groups in the neighborhood, and whether there was danger of their future infiltration. So in these manuals, so these manuals that I'm about to really talk about in depth, they were meant to train young appraisers. Like, you want to get into this business, this is what you need to know. So it would often include copies of the kinds of forms that appraisers would need to fill out. This is the copy of the FHA form that was in McMichael's appraising manual. These titles are very boring. McMichael's appraising manual is known as the Bible of appraising. So you can kind of see on this form, I'll point out over here, but you can see it over there too. These kind of things you're supposed to fill out. is transition in use taking place? Is change in occupancy taking place? So that would have been the site where you would fill in details about race in particular. And you can see the line is actually quite short, though we know that people often use the backs of these forms. But you can see there's no instructions, right? It's a very vague language. And these are the kinds of forms that would then go on to inform maps like these, which you've probably seen before, these kind of iconic redlining maps that are produced by first the HOLC, which precedes the FHA, to kind of produce these racialized maps of the city that would determine what kind of financing the federal government would, what kind of which homes in which neighborhoods the federal government would insure. And you can kind of see best, still desirable, declining. It would go on to become an A, B, C, D, E kind of ranking. So these forms would be the data that was used to produce these maps, but also these maps would then inform the local practices on the ground. So you have this kind of local federal interchange of this data. And yet it can be easy to forget when looking at these totalizing color-coded maps, they were composed through the aggregation of millions of individual and subjective acts of observation. You've probably seen these maps many times, right? But to think about all the data that goes into producing these maps, and all the data that was used that were based on producing a racial reading of a block, right? How did they go about and decide who was living on that block and make racial determinations about the people on that block, which is the part that I'm particularly interested in. The highly local and individualized processes of racial perception and observation used to create these maps have yet to be systematically detailed. The report evaluator form, this earlier form, provides no instruction as to what counts as inharmonious or how to empirically measure its presence, leaving this determination up to the evaluator's discretion. A form takes for granted that either A, identifying such groups was so obvious a task and didn't need explicit direction, B, it was more generative to let appraisers define these categories as they saw fit, and possibly, and I think most likely C, only the perception of inharmonious groups mattered, since the sense of things was the most important factor in predicting a property's present and future value. So it wasn't actually about what was empirically there, it's about kind of predicting how the market's going to react. And the market being white, middle-class homeowners is determining what the FHA thought of as the market in this period, right? So maybe the empiricism doesn't even matter, which we'll see, I think, a little bit in these manuals. So while the act of appraising a building's physical properties might be straightforwardly described as a series of actions designed to reveal the truth of a building's condition, so in these manuals, most of these manuals are filled with, like, this is how you check out a roof, this is how you check out a foundation, right? These very kind of empirical observations that you can go and test and know if a roof is good or bad. But the act of evaluating a neighborhood involved, you couldn't quite do that in the same way when you're evaluating the neighborhood, which involved inhabiting and reproducing local methods for making largely racial judgments that are not based or rooted in genealogy. Like they don't care about who your great-grandfather was, right? So what happens to the one-drop rule, which is really kind of the rule 2 or 3 decades before these maps. Or close looking, right? They're not necessarily doing kind of racial science physiognomy, but on what could be glimpsed and tolerated by one's current and, most importantly, one's future neighborhood. What was then the method guiding the appraiser's task in relation to race? Was appraisal to be a science of property observation, which required him to produce empirical observations about race, or was the appraiser's aim to become a well-tuned social barometer for white middle-class perceptual practices? Making this even more complicated was the fact that practices for perceiving and claiming to know race were far from settled across this period. Systems like the one-drop rule privileging hidden genealogical knowledge over bodily observation at the turn of the century are increasingly proving less and less useful in a world of urbanization, migration, and social anonymity. And that's really the subject of my first book. It's about the kind of collision of the one-drop rule and urban sites of anonymity, and how the skyscraper really kind of animates conversations about how you're going to read race in dense and anonymous urban environments. And we're obviously further from that moment in the mid-century, but these questions still linger. The practices of looking scripted by appraisal materials reflect some of the logics undergirding broader national efforts to stabilize racial perception and definition in the first half of the 20th century, from the passage of Jim Crow laws to Supreme Court rulings in citizenship cases barring Indians and East Asians from claiming whiteness. In all of these instances, we find the desire to mark and classify race coexisting with ambiguities as to how exactly such an adjudication should get done. And to kind of tie into the theme of the seminar, this experiencing the city, it's really the experience of the city, I'm claiming, that really starts to change the ways that race gets adjudicated, or the ways that race gets seen, known, legalized, federalized, written about in manuals like this. In early appraisal manuals attempting, since most appraisers believed a home's value to be deeply impacted by its proximity to inharmonious groups, manuals needed to address this crucial step of assessment. But how exactly this assessment of the inharmonious was to be carried out is generally obscured in these manuals. So charting the differing orientations toward racial appraisal appearing in manuals between the 1920s and 60s will allow us to put these manuals in conversation with other forms of neighborhood observation, which is where I eventually want to go. Okay, so in early appraisal manuals attempting to demonstrate the field's legitimacy as a profession, the task of identifying racial others for the purpose of valuation belongs to a broader imperative to package appraisal as an empirically oriented science. So in the early origins of the field, right, it's this new field that's really trying to to become a national field, become a science. You see the language of, you see the kind of striving language around this in some of its early manuals. So in Frederick Babcock's 1924 manual, The Appraisal of Real Estate, he strongly advocates for real estate appraisal becoming like a science. The appraiser, in his words, must avoid being one who, quote, looks at property immediately and applies his judgment as to value, and should rather carry himself, quote, like a research investigator, occupied solely with the gathering of data and their orderly classification. Babcock suggested the appraiser go outside of himself, to disembed himself from the scene of the local in order to judge a property based on the facts on the ground. In fact, this is what ends up being so important about not just Babcock's manual, but the later FHA manuals at large, that they displace the language of explicit discrimination based in supremacy with the language of data and classification, making racism an intangible rooted in impersonal markets that realtors and homeowners are only there to observe and follow. Realtors are presented in these manuals as being helpless to change these mores without serious financial injury to themselves. And David Freund, a historian, has really traced this shift in language in this book called Colored Property. He really talks about the difference, say, between 1920s, where people, white neighborhoods would say, we don't want these people to live here because we don't like them, you know, to the language of the mid-century, where the language becomes, we don't want other people different from us to move here because my property values will go down. So this kind of shift in language. So I kind of been just piggybacking on that claim to just add this idea that it's not the manual's language about race where we might change the origins of this slide, but in this discourse of empiricism preceding the discussion of race, where the seeds that kind of allow that shift in language to happen. But there remain discrepancies in the field about how much empiricism and standardization was too much. Whereas Babcock insisted that data and classification can fully supplant personal judgment, Robert Thorley and William H. Stickney in their 1926 text, Real Estate Forms, suggest that judgment can never be completely excised from the process of valuation. In fact, personal judgment may be the appraiser's most valuable asset. And this is a quote from their manual. Appraising requires a thorough knowledge of the principles and practices of real estate in all its branches. There are no set forms in this branch of the profession. Here, the personal equation enters to a great degree, as the integrity, ability, knowledge, and sound reasoning powers of the appraiser, coupled with the use of all information compiled and long experience, are his aids, end quote. So for Thorley and Stickney, good appraisal judgment accrues through long experience, coupled with more empirically based information. Whereas Babcock's method invested in norming local data and making a national standard of classification would become adopted on a federal level, Stickney and Thorley have no such eyes towards the national scene. They're writing for local appraisers and real estate agents whose knowledge of local idiosyncrasies is part of what makes them good at their job. It is only in the process of accrued judgment balanced by information that one can anticipate what the common man of their town will want or fear. Babcock and the FHA manual created under his tutelage erases this process of experience, making appraisal sound as scientific as possible. Okay, so once we get to Stanley McMichael's appraising manual, published in 1937, we find Babcock's language of empirical appraisal more explicitly meeting the language of racial adjudication. So in a section on blighted areas, McMichaels advocates this course of action. Quote, the appraiser must approach the problem with an open mind and effectively combat any preconceived notions, blind prejudice, or snap judgment he may have formed. His appraisal should be made with the head and not with the heart, and he must base his conclusions on facts and not fancies, bearing in mind at all times that he is judging the future and not the past. And I should mention that this is about it in terms of the language you get around blighted areas. And that's true in all the manuals I'm going to note. There are these thick, fat things that have all of this data, but when it gets to the inevitable section when they're talking about inharmonious groups or blighted areas, you get very little description. You get maybe a few paragraphs. And so none of them are actually laying out any practices, but they're laying out this kind of vague language of principles. Though this was the most important factor in determining a property's financial value or its estimated value. Okay, so about this particular quote. Here we have yet another example of the valuation manual insisting on the mindset in which an evaluator must approach the act of appraising while offering no detail as to what appraisers are actually to read within this environment. The vague task of judging the future and not the past, based on the head and not the heart, is directed towards a frame of mind and away from any actual tactics of interpretation. The language of rational observation starts to feel increasingly performative in these manuals, a way for appraisal to claim the authority of a science, to mask its inability to make perception itself into a scientific instrument as such. The language of empiricism gets even hazier when we get into the mid-century. Earl Teckemeyer's How to Value Real Estate, the Foremost Factor in Selling from 1956, includes a section titled, quote, Infiltration of Foreign or Racial Groups. So this is Teckemeyer's version of this paragraph. Quote, the danger of deflated values from such sources is so self-evident that it does not require heated debate or lengthy discussion. Where a whole area is changing over, as many of them are in many cities in America today, there is a consequent change in values. It is not difficult to ascertain the areas where such changes are taking place, and not difficult at all to determine, by comparing recent sale prices of properties on the market, what the normal percentage of evaluation must be. So what's striking about Teckemeyer's passage is that the language of surveying the neighborhood, prominent in previous manuals, has now been removed. The dangers of infiltration are so self-evident and not difficult to determine or ascertain that both the intellectual pose of empiricism and the what of interpretation are written out. The passage is not geared towards a mode or framework of assessment, but rather a defense of what has already become self-evident, pointing towards an assessment that has seemingly already taken place in the past. He manages to reify racial accounting without ever having to utter a word related to race. The evaluator in his assessment needs only to be aware of the financial consequences for a neighborhood's changing over. If Babcock's appraiser was the ultimate Enlightenment hero, boldly empirical in his observational work, then Teckemeyer's appraiser is merely a number cruncher, conveniently beholden to the stats. And this is one more example from 1963. This is Alfred A. Ring's The Valuation of Real Estate. We get kind of a different version of this language in the same section of the book. Quote, despite educational and legal efforts to bring about the acceptance of true democratic doctrines enforced even when an inadvertent mixing of residents with diverse historical backgrounds within a neighborhood has immediate and depressing influences on value. Often just the threat of infiltration, such as rumors within the stock market, causes market values of real property in the areas to be adversely affected. This was kind of the second paragraph. He cites a statistic about Negro occupancy, and that's his language, lowering property values by 25%, and says this: the necessity and importance of inventorying and reporting the background characteristics of neighborhood residents appears obvious. It must be kept in mind, however, that it is not the opinion or personal preferences of the appraiser that are to be reflected, but rather an objective prediction of the anticipated action or reaction of typical buyers who may purchase properties for use and occupancy in the subject area. So I hope you can see all the kind of gymnastics in these quotes, right? Like you have to imagine you're an empiricist, but then you have to imagine how other people are going to respond to this thing, but not people in the present, people in the future, right? It's really kind of complicated series of perceptual and imaginative and speculative practices. The language of Babcock's scientific appraiser returns here, but defensively, as a shield for the appraiser to wield in the face of accusations of personal preference. Ring engages in hand-wringing when introducing this topic, lamenting that true democratic doctrines based in equality do not yet line up with market desires. where the evaluator's job is to bury his own opinion and be the eyes of the typical buyer. Again, how one hazards an objective prediction of the typical buyer's reaction is not detailed. Instead, the manual provides a defensive method without supplying a method itself. And also, I should say that these statistics about Negro occupancy lowering property values have been proven to not be true. That even this kind of empirical fact of the market, there's been a lot of research to suggest that counterexamples to suggest that when you do have kind of mixed race neighborhoods, Negro occupancy was not necessarily going to destroy property values, as was taken as a truth and a given guiding these manuals. While early appraisal manuals in the 20s and 30s advocate more explicitly and less apologetically for race-based appraisal, those published in the post-war, mid-century advocate for this process in more delicate and oblique ways, but with no less urgency. What remains true for all of these manuals, however, is that processes for determining whose presence is intrusive or infiltrating is never explicitly addressed. Appraisers mark a need for flexibility in assessing these categories, but this flexibility also suggests the fundamental instability underlying practices of racial appraisal, despite the attempts of appraisers to anchor them in discourses of scientific empiricism. Practices of blockbusting that actively manipulated the faulty empiricism of appraiser and homeowners to make a quick profit suggest just how unsteady this science actually was. Real estate speculators, also known as blockbusters, and blockbusters were both black and white, and there was this kind of cultural figure in the 60s and the 70s. There's an episode of All in the Family, in its first season, where Archie Bunker is approached by a black blockbuster, and it's fascinating because Archie wants to sell, he wants to make this quick buck and leave the neighborhood, and it's Meathead who says you can't sell to this evil blockbuster who's essentially trying to integrate the neighborhood, but with a very clear economic motive in mind. But even it's the thing that like liberal Meathead and Bunker come around is fighting the blockbuster, which is fascinating. So real estate speculators would do such things as, this is an article from the Saturday Evening Post called "Confessions of a Blockbuster." This is a pseudonym, Alfred Bach, and he kind of talks about all the secrets and the ways that blockbusters create panic and fear. So white homeowners would sell for not very much money, and then they would flip and sell homes to African Americans for very inflated prices. So he kind of talks about some of these practices. So real estate speculators would do such thing as hire black women to walk carriages through white neighborhoods, or orchestrate phone calls to white homes where the callers ask for, quote, such people as Johnny May. Sometimes calls, quote, one blockbuster describes, would consist only of a whisper, a drunken laugh, or a warning such as, they're coming. Such stunts were designed to get whites to sell their properties to speculators cheaply, who would resell these properties to blacks at inflated prices. Where appraisal manuals fail to tell us how race is signaled in red, blockbusting practices start to provide us with some of these missing details through the ways that they stage racial signs using glimpsed bodies and vocal texture. So in some ways, I'm finding this archive to be more helpful in terms of what people are actually reading and responding to and calling race, right? Or kind of reading racialized affects or sounds and voices even. Appraisers and realtors imagine themselves to be merely reacting to race, but I posit that hyperlocal practices of reading bodies and buildings block by block played a far more active role in shaping how race was being seen, imagined, and performed at mid-century. Less scientific empiricists, realtors appear to be more like students and shapers of a changing phenomenology of race. Unlike the American obsession at the turn of the 20th century with racial percentages and the science of physiognomy, the housing market encouraged Americans to traffic in more fungible and approximate fictions of race, sloughing off the veneer of exhaustive precision, undergirding earlier tenets of racial detection for what could be gathered in glimpses out of the window and deciphered from telephone whispers. Okay, so part 3. So in this part, I examine the efforts of 2 mid-century writers, Jane Jacobs and Gwendolyn Brooks, as they imagined the relationship between residential looking and racial looking in ways that diverged from professional appraisal's obligation to the market. Though Jacobs and Brooks might seem like an odd pairing, Brooks being best known as a poet and Jacobs as an urban activist, Both were perpetual genre crossers, interested in the work of residential observation and spaces not traditionally considered models for living. In light of Appraisal's interest in racial observation as financial instrument, these writers raise questions about whether the command to look closely, embraced by appraisers upholding residential segregation, could ever be made to serve other means. Well, let's start with Jane Jacobs. So Jane Jacobs first posed her own reactionary brand of appraisal in her 1961 epic work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Imploring her readers to table the opinions of urban planners, described by her as practitioners of pseudoscience akin to bloodletters, she urges her readers instead to, quote, please look closely at real cities and take the time to listen and linger about what you see. So this is kind of in the frontispiece material to the book. Usually in this part you see illustrations, you get the numbers, like this is the number in the list of illustrations. But she pulls this kind of clever trick where she says, there are no illustrations, right? Just walk outside. And those are going to be your illustrations about how the city works. Jacobs provides an example of this form of looking in her account of Boston's North End. Considered a slum by two experts she consults, a planner and a banker, Jacobs declares this district instead, quote, the healthiest place in the city. Comparing her impressions of this neighborhood in 1940 when it was, quote, badly overcrowded, housing the flood of, quote, the flood of immigrants first from Ireland, then from Eastern Europe, and finally from Sicily, Jacobs marvels in 1960, so 20 years after that kind of first assessment, that the streets of the North End are, quote, alive with children playing, people shopping, people strolling, people talking. Taking stock of the improved building exteriors and the mingled usages, Jacobs is so stimulated by the infectious nature of the, quote, general street atmosphere of buoyance, friendliness, and good health, that she writes, quote, I began asking directions of people just for the fun of getting in some talk. For all of her antagonism toward her institutional forebears in the field of urban assessment, Jacobs' pedagogy of observation ignores its conditionality, which appraisers had been intensely, if imperfectly, attending to for decades prior. Jacobs critiques the banker and the planner for not looking often or closely enough at the North End to correctly assess its health, but her own looking is not without idiosyncrasies, leading her to privilege certain diagnoses over others. If we take Jacobs' description of the North End as a model of her observational method, and it comes quite early in the book, so it is presented as this kind of test case that's going to guide the rest of the book, this method largely centers on what the eye can take in from and of the street. She never enters a home in this neighborhood. Instead, her sense of their interiors come from the, quote, Venetian blinds and glimpses of fresh paint that she can spy through windows. The only time she directly engages anyone in the neighborhood, moreover, is to ask for directions she doesn't need, quote, for the fun of getting in some talk, emphasizing the performance of something like local color over content, or her own pleasant experience of exoticism over residents' own experience of the health of their surrounds. This is not to romanticize the depth of knowledge local informants may or may not have divulged to her had she inquired, but just to demonstrate how Jacobs naturalizes her particular observational procedures. She takes as a given, furthermore, that it is the North End rather than her own perception that is the moving part in this scene. But it is unclear if what Jacobs offers us here is new knowledge about the changes to the North End in the 20 years since her first visit, or the changes to her own appraisal criteria in this time. If Jacobs is generally less self-conscious than the authors of appraisal manuals regarding observation's various methods, she shares their obliqueness regarding mechanisms of racial observation. The lack of racial markers in Jacobs' description of her second visit to the North End in 1960 is particularly noteworthy in this regard. Accounting for the ethnic, or what would have been then, a racial history central to her experience in the neighborhood in 1940, so she charts the flood of immigrants first from Ireland, then from Eastern Europe, and finally from Sicily that called the North End home. That was her account in the 1940s, when she kind of moves forward to the present. No references to race appear in her 1960s account of the neighborhood. The North End continues to retain its identity as an Italian neighborhood even today, but how one saw racially marked Italians had shifted in the decades separating Jacobs' two studies. By the time of her second visit, some of the Italian immigrants who had lived there in the 40s had secured mortgages elsewhere, moving out of the North End to suburban neighborhoods where their ability to secure mortgages rested upon being seen as harmonious enough not to trouble the property values of their neighbors. As for the Italians who remained in the North End in 1960, Despite retaining the legibility of this distinctly Italian identity through their contextual association with this neighborhood, these residents had taken on many of the privileges as well as the prejudices of whiteness. North Enders largely opposed the presence of African Americans in their neighborhoods, and in a few short years, the neighborhood would serve as a seat of anti-busing sentiment. Whether Jacobs' elision of racial markers and her more recent observations of the North End tells us more about the racial status of Italians or Jacobs' own racial vision is hard to say, but whatever the reason, her injunctive to, quote, please look closely, evaporates in relation to race in this inaugural example. Jacobs' elision of both the race of others as well as her own position as observer matters to the shape of her diagnosis of the North End. The elements Jacobs admires about the North End, quote, the general street atmosphere of buoyance, friendliness, and good health, could be read as symptoms of its homogeneity, facilitating this easy ambience. One wonders if Jacobs would have experienced the street with the same jubilance had she herself not been appraised by the residents of the street as someone whose racial presence did not threaten their own good, quote, good health. Although critics have taken Jacobs to task for not attending more fully to race's effects on neighborhood outcomes in death and life, she was not blind to this matter. She acknowledges elsewhere in the book that, quote, planning and design fail to automatically overcome segregation and discrimination since, as she writes, too many efforts are also required to fight through these injustices. So she's thinking about these questions later in the book. And yet Jacobs' method of observation never accounts for the non-neutrality of her own vision, overlooking the accumulated practices for seeing and assessing race that have largely determined who lives where in the U.S. and how these neighborhoods accrue value. Just as the racial performances staged by blockbusters preyed upon the vulnerability and the paranoia of the homeowner's gaze, primed to defensively read the racial sign in order to protect his or her financial investment in the whiteness of their neighborhood, Jacobs' version of observation is similarly contingent upon race, if less self-consciously so. She ignores just how quickly a good neighborhood might reveal its less virtuous qualities in the presence of someone deemed to depreciate its racial and, by extension, financial stability. So I'll close by juxtaposing Jacobs' mode of urban empiricism with the version that Gwendolyn Brooks experiments with only a few years prior. So while Brooks' most extended exploration in seeing within underseen and undervalued urban environments takes place in her fiction, she reiterates these concerns in her October 1951 article for Holiday magazine called They Call It Bronzeville. And this piece is a kind of fascinating bit in her career. She had just won the Pulitzer Prize the year before this for Annie Allen. And she then kind of gets this assignment with Nelson Algren in the special issue of Holiday, which many writers wrote in. Faulkner famously wrote articles. Lots of celebrated fiction writers writing for Holiday. So she writes this piece of urban reportage and never returns to the genre. So this is kind of the one anomaly in her career. So the piece opens with a blunt description of Bronzeville as, quote, something that should not exist, an area set aside for the halting use of a single race. So from the outset, Brooks discourages her reader from a romantic or folksy reading of Bronzeville by underscoring its origins in discriminatory processes. Unlike Jacobs' exuberant account of the North End, Brooks is less interested in describing the characteristics of the South Side than in establishing its origins in inequality, a fact that no amount of vibrant streets and Venetian blinds can ameliorate. Quote, however, since Bronzeville does exist, Brooks continues, it is satisfying to demonstrate that here resides essentially only what is ordinary. And satisfying is such a kind of interesting verb, right? It's not happy, it's like, okay, well then I'll tell you what's here, but don't forget this fact. The story of Bronzeville, Brooks warns us, is fundamentally one of compromise. There are no lessons to be taken away about how cities work here, only examples of people living in them. For Brooks, it is precisely the lack of profundity to be derived from a study of this neighborhood that most strongly attests to the injustices of its singular demographics mark. So the figure we follow for most of They Call It Bronzeville is not Brooks, but a hypothetical white stranger, spelled at all times with a capital S, whose expectations are continually thwarted by his actual encounters with Bronzeville. And I believe that the kind of nested reference to this white stranger is this piece written by John Bartlow Martin in Harper's Magazine 10 months before this piece, which is called The Strangest Place in Chicago. And Brooks cites this article when she writes her masterwork In the Mecca, which is about the real Mecca housing complex that were torn down for the IIT campus in Chicago and replaced by this kind of beautiful Mies van der Rohe campus. So this piece by John Bartlow Martin comes out 10 months before this piece. And in this piece, the Bartlow Martin piece, it starts with this man with the writer who's in the loop, and he talks about all the sunshine in the loop, and then going down into the depths and the guts of the city to Bronzeville and into this dilapidated housing space. It's a really kind of exploitative piece where he's kind of talking about these black residents in this housing complex are really kind of out of history and out of time. And the whole shtick of the piece is like, I'm going to take you readers into this like bizarre place. And it's called The Strangest Place in Chicago. So the fact that she calls her white narrator the stranger, I'm pretty sure she's kind of riffing on this piece, especially because she again cites that same article almost 15 years later. So this piece really stuck with her. Okay. So Brooks' stranger. The stranger expects spectacular encounters and outrageous sights to dominate his visit to the South Side, but his visit is generally humdrum. Quote, so up and down, and across and back. Our stranger, seeing exquisite homes in one block and miserable homes in the next, seeing neat gardens and painful alleys, end quote. So the object of Brooks' observation in the article is not so much Bronzeville, so ordinary, it's almost boring, but the stranger, whose attempts to categorize it or produce a narrative about its meaning, are stymied. And this is from the end of the article. And I just gave a version of this that focused more on other moments in Brooks' career at the Gwendolyn Brooks conference that we just held at University of Chicago a few weeks ago. And I had never heard the poetry that ends this piece until there were many poets in the room who kind of talked about the way that this ends in lyric. So hopefully, and as I read it, you'll hear the lyric, which I did not hear until just recently. His tour of Bronzeville over, Brooks writes, our friend from Out of Bounds is a little bewildered. He does not quite know how to feel. Perhaps he expected something different. He has not known many Negroes. The article concludes with this stranger's struggle to bring Bronzeville into description. So here's the lyric. Back home, the stranger wonders to himself. He shakes his head. He holds his chin. He plans to tell his friends where he has been. I have been, he has been in a place where people live. So you can hear the kind of off rhymes and the rhymes that are in there, chin and been and live, which are kind of not quite rhymes, right? So she's kind of disrupting the neat rhyme there. I still am figuring out what to do with that because it's a new revelation to me. But anyways, okay, so Brooks proves less concerned with what the stranger sees and more with his failure to turn seeing into knowing. The stranger's empirical account of Bronzeville does not ultimately allow him to say much about what this place is, marking instead his failure to classify this neighborhood as anything more than a generalized place where people live. So in some ways, Brooks, and this is kind of moving towards the conclusion now, in some ways, Brooks most fully inhabits the ethos of the appraiser in this article, continually trying to get beyond her own perceptual embeddedness by staging the experience of Bronzeville through the perceptions of a white stranger, which is exactly what appraisers were doing in this period, or being trained to do, right? Don't imagine your own self, right? Imagine these future white residents and what they're going to see. It is a strategy she returns to time and again in her mid-century fiction, particularly in Montmartre, 1953's Montmartre, and 1960's The Bean Eaters. Whereas Jacobs is constantly figuring herself in opposition to appraisers and planners whose version of urban empiricism she finds destructive, thus overlooking her own blind faith in the empirical, Brooks actively inhabits a number of positions in empirical practices, refusing to settle on a single claim or perceptual anchor. The stranger's concluding assessment of Bronzeville as, quote, a place where people live rather than where Negroes live might seem like a liberal triumph of colorblindness, right? I don't see Negroes anymore, it's just where people are. But if we remember Brooks's warning at the article's opening that Bronzeville will be understood first and foremost as evidence of racial segregation, something you don't need to see in person to know is true. And again, I see her putting pressure on this idea that you need to go to Bronzeville to know something about segregation. The stranger's decision to leave race unmarked suggests he has missed the point. Brooks enacts a delicate balance here, stripping racial reading of its powers of fixity, while at the same time insisting that Bronzeville's blackness be appraised and accounted for, reading it as a symptom not of objective market value, but of the systematic devaluing of black lives. The stranger's account of Bronzeville, culminating with his anti-epiphany about its mundaneness, presents the neighborhood's blackness to Holliday's largely white readership as an inescapable fact, rather than something one must personally feel or experience. So I see her in this sense kind of almost like dismantling the very enterprise of neighborhood observation. Where if this first line is the only thing you need to know about Bronzeville, right, and it's something that should not exist, then you don't have to go to Bronzeville and have some sort of personal experience of Bronzeville to reckon with this fact, right? The fact of this accounting means you need to go somewhere else. You might need to go to City Hall. You might need to go to All White Beverly, which she also writes about in a wonderful poem. That looking at Bronzeville is not going to teach you something about this fact of something, a neighborhood that should not exist. The article's there are no epiphanic encounters with racial others here teaching the stranger and thusly the reader something new about race. The article's most poignant realization comes rather from the stranger's failure to make sense of Bronzeville's blackness, the reasons for which cannot be found by looking harder or better or more rationally at its streets, but originates somewhere beyond Bronzeville itself. Understanding why it exists or the why behind the valuation of its buildings cannot be surmised from looking more closely at Bronzeville. And again, counter this with Jacobs' own insistence, like just go outside and look and you will understand everything about how cities work. And I see Brooks as saying that looking is not necessarily the tool that you think it's going to be. Following Brooks then, redressing residential segregation requires redirecting our attention away from the neighborhood segregation produced and towards the methods contrived to observe, record, and appraise racialized bodies in order to enforce their segregation. Given that acts of racial determination used to uphold segregation were simultaneously aesthetic and empirical judgments, both documentations and fictionalizations, the study of these operations within the expanded literatures of residential segregation, to further follow Brooks, is not only the domain of the social sciences, it must also be the domain of the poet. That's it.
Yeah.
Loved your talk. So I just had a kind of a question observation, and partly because I'm just in the midst of teaching in Patricia Street. So
oh, great.
I'm thinking about this a lot. And I was thinking about the act of appraising being in African American literature, a kind of definition of whiteness, and of course, so thinking about the way in which the white characters in that novel are continually appraising. Always evaluation. I mean, that kind of the capitalist, always kind of in a capitalist sense, always appraising the value of property and people, right?
Totally.
And black people. And then I was also thinking of this as a kind of is the poetry here at the end kind of defamiliarizing the white strangers. He can no longer. It's not an act of appraisal here. It's befuddlement. So,
right.
So is there that kind of turn there? And so I was just wondering if you could. Maybe speak a little bit more about how you see this, I guess, trope or practice of appraising within African American literature more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, the street is interesting because I've actually been thinking about this in relationship to the street. What's so interesting about the street is, the first chapter we're on the street and we're following Ludi, and then we get the flashback to her time in the suburbs. And my reading of that novel is it's in the suburbs where she's actually learning to read the street. So there's this weird, because why not have that moment before the moment, right? It's out of order, right? Yeah. And what she's learning in the suburbs is this new way to read. They literally give her all these materials that they're not reading, right? They're constantly saying, we never open these magazines. So for those of you who haven't read The Street in a while, the novel features it's this naturalist novel that's often coupled with Native Son, Black naturalist classics from the 40s. It opens with a black woman who's in New York trying to find housing, the first chapter, and she's kind of reading the street that she's on and is really kind of paranoid. I find her a really unreliable narrator in this moment. And then in the second chapter, you kind of learn that before this moment of looking for housing, she had spent many months working in the suburbs and living in the suburbs as kind of live-in help. And I read that chapter as her learning how to appraise property through the eyes of the suburbanites, who she kind of hates, but also kind of wants to be white. And she's kind of figuring out different modes of understanding property appraisal and valuation. So I read that first chapter as her really inhabiting in some ways.
And she's so ambivalent about boundaries. I mean, that's what I mean about, that's what it's so fascinating.
Yeah.
About wanting privacy, but then also seeing the boundary of segregation.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
Yeah.
So I mean, part of this project that I'm trying to do, this residential aesthetics project, is to see what happens when we decouple, or you often decouple the Great Migration from white flight, right? The kind of quick and dirty story is that, you know, the Great Migration happens beginning in 1915, goes to 1970s, and then white flight happens in the 40s and the 50s, kind of in response to African Americans moving to the city. But what if we think about that as one larger movement, right? And not just a kind of physical movement, but also a literary movement, like an aesthetic movement. The writers, black writers of black migration and white writers of white flight are all writing about migration, and all kind of have a shared canon, migratory text. So like in another piece that I'm writing related to this project, I'm reading John Cheever as kind of having learned from earlier Great Migration novels about how to write about white flight, which was also a migration. And he writes about it as a migration, about these kind of people who had never lived in the suburbs, where all the people who were living in the suburbs are not from the suburbs in 1958. And these new developments, they didn't exist. So this kind of experience of migration, that what happens if you kind of mix up the canon, or kind of have, not mix up, but kind of trace the mixing up that's already within these canons, and you have this kind of rich, for me, this rich archive of appraisal, real estate valuation that's kind of moving across AFAM literary traditions, but also kind of white writers who are also making sense of migration and movement in racialized terms. So that's part of where I'm going with this. So this is, I think, just to echo your point that, yes, I think you can kind of see this interest in appraisal and observation and looking throughout African American literature. The other ways I'm reading Brooks is in relation to a number of mid-century writers who kind of put down fiction to take up acts of urban reportage. Someone like Baldwin, who's less in need of a distinction because he's kind of doing reportage all the time, but he writes these pieces about Harlem, Ralph Ellison on Harlem is Nowhere, Thomas Pynchon writing about Watts. So I'm kind of interested in why fiction writers are turning to this particular mode of urban reportage, particularly in the 50s and the 60s, or I guess like late 40s to the 60s, and what they think what's that about? Because it's not necessarily common today, right? You don't have writers who are necessarily doing these kind of urban reportage pieces about neighborhoods, or even just residential neighborhoods, right? What is my neighborhood? What is a neighborhood? How do you read a neighborhood? We have all these fiction writers who get interested in this. You could add Richard Wright to this list. All these writers are interested in documenting neighborhoods, and I think it has something to do with the story of appraisal and what the work of looking is, but I'm still trying to figure out all those connections. Yeah, we'll just go around. Is that all right?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting talk. I'm trying to still figure out how everything fits
Yeah,
together. In a way, I feel like, in a way, you've got these what I see as representations of three separate literatures that you're sort of joining with particular understanding of appraisal or a particular act of observation, which I think is really this sort of epistemological and ontological sort of question, right? And in a way, I feel like this paper belongs in science studies. It's right in some kind of way. And so, but I mean, so I say that as kind of like a preference, and then I'm trying to figure out what that then means for situating the notion of appraisal in like quasi-scientific literature, the notion of Jane Jacobs in a different kind of literature of white investigation of the city against the context of urban planning, which is different.
Yes, totally.
Brooks also writing this sort of outlier piece that's addressing the sort of a practical reality of the body of her broader work, right? And so it's kind of interesting to think about these three things together, but also I think raises problems in that I think that, for example, with the Jacobs piece, you continually use the word appraisal, right? Which I think is sort of an easy way to sort of link or to limit her observation into a different kind of category of observation. And I guess I wonder, I guess if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily wedded to these pieces going together.
And then I don't see the same thing happening in Brooks, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's your orientation is coming clear in the way that you limitedly read each literature base.
Sure, that's interesting. I guess appraisal is, one of the things that I'm trying to work out on this piece is what is the relationship to something like appraisal as a kind of codified field, or a field that's trying to become codified in this period, that's doing It's a professional field, it's an academic field that's professionalizing, and I guess this larger work of what I would call kind of urban observation. That certainly, Jacob certainly doesn't understand herself as an appraiser, neither does Brooks, right? But what does link them is this interest in what does it mean to go out and look at a neighborhood and produce a reading of that neighborhood. So I don't have quite the umbrella. I think one way I'll have to think about this is that these are kind of all terms under some larger umbrella that right now the placeholder for that term is something like urban residential, residential observation. Let's keep it like that, because I'm actually interested in the ways that urban and suburban get collapsed in some of these texts. But okay, let's say residential observation, and then we have all these kind of different strategies and methods. And political positions, training, audiences, who are all kind of moving around in this mid-century period, asking these similar kinds of questions about, or kind of raising the question of what it means to look, whether it's to valorize it or to not valorize it. But that's kind of why I'm trying to hold these things together.
And I think like a more satisfying read would be something that situates these readings in their context. And I think you do that in the appraisal section, but then when you get to the Brooks and the Jacobs section, you don't have that same situation, right? You don't have that historical development of the language that approaches what that sense of observation is, right? And so we have to carry, in a sense, and I think with Jacobs is particularly problematic because she has this. Elsewhere in that same book, she talks about political structure. She talks about the district and structural process.
She certainly does.
And so I think that's a different kind of observation than the limited reading of her is someone who's interested in engaging the literature of the street or reading the street.
But she is doing that,
right?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. But I think this is the mistake that everyone makes, especially books, which is it's easy to latch onto that piece, but then this piece where she's talking about the district as the essential political and economic connector to structure.
Sure. Yes, and that's definitely true. And I don't want to make Jacobs a straw woman. And I'm trying to think about this. I quote this part where she is. It's not like she's blind to race and she's blind to forces. She certainly is not. But it's interesting in these moments that she doesn't connect it to these other forces, right? She strategically comes out of those modes of structural and kind of readings of the city as a structural creation, right? In these moments of whimsy or whatever she's doing in this scene, right? It's just, she's working through a method in that piece. So there's certainly unevenness in that book. But I'm interested in why in this moment, in this kind of inaugural moment, where you could see her doing that kind of work, right? It was very available for her to read the North End in all these ways and how it gets produced and why the North End even still exists in the way it exists, right? But she chooses to not do that in that moment. And what your comment is making me think is that it would be even more interesting to kind of think about the languages she does have available to her in Death and Life, and why it kind of falls out in this moment, and this important moment because it's so early in the book where she's kind of walking through this method that is actually much more complicated and sophisticated than she lets on, but in this moment she kind of really simplifies everything, I think to some kind of, not to her benefit, right? And so it would be kind of interesting to think about that. That's really helpful.
Absolutely. And so that connects it to that broader historical, social, and political environment of the development of her writing, why she's writing this piece at this time.
Right.
And I'd like to see the same thing with the Brooks piece though too, right?
Yeah.
I think that you're sort of relying on the reader's understanding of Brooks' position, as a particular kind of author in a particular kind of moment dealing with these issues in order to sort of focus her attention on race and place, right?
Yeah. But that's just what she's doing.
Right. but you don't make that clear, right?
Okay. All right, I can make that clear. I can certainly make that clear.
But it's great. It's totally fascinating.
Thanks. But these are the things that this is very early in the project, so I'm still trying to figure out what's the arc that's going to hold together these very different figures who are, as you're saying, writing in very different ways and to very different people, but are still kind of all pursuing this question of what does it mean to, and for me in this project, the literature of residential literature is the literature of segregation in this period. That's just the kind of the truism that I'm working with. And to think about the different ways that these writers deal with that, don't deal with that, talk about that, don't talk about that, under the guise of observation is what's the kind of, I think, the thing that's linking all these people. Thank you so much, it was super helpful.
I thought this was so interesting. I have two questions. The first one is, I'm really taken by the idea of the literature of residential integration and segregation in this time period, and I'm just wondering what continuities or discontinuities you see with more contemporary or later art about that? Because I mean, I was just thinking in terms of like, it's about these social processes, and as you pointed out, we think about the Great Migration and we think about white flight as two distinct things, but they're actually just part of a very long process. And I mean, I would add to that, the idea of gentrification. So, I mean, I'm thinking really obviously about Clybourne Park, which is about, I mean, for anybody, the Raisin in the Sun house is like less than a mile away that way.
Yes.
And Clybourne Park
there
is
today.
a book that's about what happens to that house later. But even things like, I mean, in film, like Do the Right Thing is dealing with a lot of these issues. And I'm just wondering if you see continuities there. The other question I have, which may be sort of more off the wall, but I'm a sociologist, and when I hear somebody talk about The Stranger in 1951, I can't help but think about Zimmel, that he got translated into English, I think around this time period, around 1950.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about Gwendolyn Brooks' reading habits to know if she had read this, but you can see a lot of similarities between what she's talking about here and what Zimmel was talking about, 50 years earlier.
Sure. No, I'll answer that one, and then I'll I think of Brooks as responding to Zimmel in kind of mediated sense through U of C sociology.
Okay.
And through Robert Parks.
Sure.
So in a different version of this talk, I kind of think about other moments in Brooks's career where she's thinking about the questions of what it means to look, which I see kind of spanning from the kind of her first book of poetry, which is The Street in Bronzeville, which comes out in the late 1940s, all the way to almost the end of her career. And I do a similar kind of work here, but instead of situating Brooks next to Jacobs, in Appraisal, I situate her next to the Chicago Observers. So kind of think about her mode of looking next to Part, Ernest Burgess, and I hadn't thought about like them reading Zimmel and the way that kind of mediates it. And it'd be interesting to think about what she's reading in this period in relation to something like Zimmel, because I didn't know about his translation.
I had to check it. As soon as you said it, I'm like, I knew that it was coming out about the same time, but I literally just checked now, and the early translation comes out in 1950.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I will definitely look into that. But I do think it's there. I'm pretty sure it's there in this, again, hyper-mediated form if we think about Zimmel, Park, U of C sociology. Richard Wright, who she was also really writing against in many ways, and Wright's version of the instrumental sociological that she's very explicitly, they were friends and he nurtured her career, but she writes this in Montmartre, one of her kind of her only novel. She has this chapter called Montmartre Spares the Mouse, which is this kind of response to the opening of Native Son, where Bigger destroys the rat with the pans. She has this moment where this character doesn't kill this mouse and imagines this life for this mouse. So she's really writing to Wright in interesting ways, and I believe through Wright, also writing to urban sociology, particularly in this kind of 1950s moment that she's kind of exploring all these different kinds of genres of writing too, just like Wright is as well.
Oh. Okay. So I was really interested in tying together for me were various issues of people observing from different positions in their own, or sort of imagined positions from their own. And I wanted to ask who you believe that last sentence, in whose voice is that, and why is people capitalized?
Yeah, it's weird. I don't know if it's just a relation to if Stranger is capitalized, what does it do to have people capitalized? Her own kind of relationship to capitalization is kind of interesting in this piece. He has been in a place where people live, which is not self-consciously in his voice, right? Because we have these quotations at end, but he's not even able to get to that point.
Right.
Where she kind of fills in, he has been in a place where people live, kind of creates the synthesis for him. But again, which is so striking versus this opening line, which is, yes, but also it's this place that should not exist. So people live there, right? But it's also not a place where just people live. So it's kind of this, I find this piece so fascinating, because every time I go to it and try to put my finger down on it, she's kind of moving around and making it really difficult to kind of take one piece for granted without thinking about these other pieces. So to go back to your question about whose voice this is in, I'm not sure exactly. I think it's her creating a synthesis that even he can't create. But again, it's not the final synthesis either, if you kind of go back to the beginning of the piece. And she is interested in this idea that it is this ordinary space. I mean, that's her point in the piece, is that there's nothing that extraordinary here. You can't come here to like learn anything about the Negro people. You're going to see all of these ordinary humdrum things. So I think she does mean that in this last line. But I think she doesn't necessarily mean that it's a place where people live in this kind of like post-racial sense either, right? So that's my kind of read on this line. But it is, I think it could be read in many ways. Any hand back there?
So a few things, and the first is just that when Jeff asked about the symbol, I looked it up, and Camus' A Stranger was also translated in 1946.
Right.
So I don't know. While you're
on my stranger research.
And I guess I had a couple. I'm not even sure what my questions are exactly. First off, to say I really enjoyed this talk. And I'm trying to think through a couple things, and one of them is if you're thinking about the question of urban reportage happening at this particular moment, what writers are doing this, it might be useful to think about the sort of broader history of urban chronicling by writers in an international context. This is also happening around the same time that we've got all sorts of really interesting depictions of Latin American cities, of European cities, by travelers, by other like just regular inhabitants. And the sort of history of the urban chronicle is something that I think this could really be situated in, given your 19th and the 20th century sort of upheaval of modernity that is occurring in this context as much as anywhere else.
That's great.
And so there's, if you want, I can give you some people to look at. But,
and even within a holiday, I mean, a holiday is an internet, it's really chronic. I think some of these same people who you may be thinking of were certainly, might have been publishing a holiday, which was thinking about travel in a very international sense. So that's very helpful.
But I guess the real question I have is I want to come back to the very start of your talk and this question of, you sort of, you don't want Jane Jacobs to be a strong woman, but you sort of take James Baldwin as a strong man.
I do.
And I'm wondering, like, if we come back at the end of your talk to Jacobs and to Brooks, who are actually doing the kind of thing that I think Baldwin is asking us for. And so I'm wondering about how you square that challenge to Baldwin with the later sections where you're really getting into what are, for better or for worse, really good writers. As opposed to all of the, boring manuals in between, which are certainly informing the aesthetics and the understanding of the city, and the experience of the city. But they're not aesthetically, except for vaguely, they're not really good writing. And a lot of the protest fiction, as you would call it, or you're calling them, aren't necessarily good writing. And so how do you, are you really taking Baldwin down?
That's a really great question. You're right. I have to think about this a little bit more. I guess what I'm interested in is, like this piece I think is, Baldwin would I don't know that he read this piece, but it certainly would have fit within something he would have appreciated, and he was doing similar work around urban reportage in this time completely. I guess one of the things that I'm interested in is when I go back, and the part of this project is to go back and then also talk about these novels that Baldwin hated. And to think about them as, to take his point, like I agree with him, they're not fun, and I've read all of these things. And there's some are slogs in different ways, but they all have this certain kind of flatness that Baldwin, all the reviewers, right? Baldwin's not an outlier in critiquing this fiction, right? Like many of and I kind of combed through the reviews, and they are not very happy with many of these works, so a lot of them. But to think about what kind of work that even this kind of middle brow, maybe not aesthetically compelling fiction is doing to kind of answer these questions about how they also navigate this question of urban observation and the residential. And this is kind of explosion of interest in residential neighborhood as a unit, right? And that's this idea that people are writing about where people live is not a certain it's an age-old interest, right? But this particular interest in the neighborhood as a social, spatial, and racialized unit, as kind of taking a new life when you get over half of the nation becoming homeowners in the 1950s, right? It's really this interest in home ownership that's the other driving force behind this project. It's this observation and this question of home ownership, which I think that's the other thing Appraisal allows me to bring together, is the stress on urban observation that the home ownership kind of places on the need to value neighborhoods. And I think for me, you know, I think you're right, because I did not read these kinds of what Baldwin would call reports, but I want to, and I want to figure out, and part of what I'm trying to figure out in this project is how to read these novels without reading them in the ways that Baldwin wants to read them, right? Can we find another way to read them that that doesn't negate the things that Baldwin is saying is wrong with these novels, right? But to think about the ways that they tell us something about these questions of what it means to look, which are questions that are also questions about what I'm calling aesthetics, which is a term that I'm actually still figuring out what it means in terms of the relationship to what it means to look and perception. But they are trying to figure out something about what it means to look that's different in this period, and even in these kind of very terrible novels. So I will read these novels, and I think, I don't know, I think Baldwin will remain my foil because he's so uninterested in this report, and I do think that this report, the term of the report, can be an aesthetic term, right? If we're thinking about what it means to think how people are making judgments and seeing what the work of seeing in a world like a neighborhood is, where you're not just appraising things based on their beauty, right? But what they are and how they function. Like, that's the other thing that the neighborhood does as a site of appraisal, because you can't let go of this idea of the beautiful, because people are appraising based on this idea of the beautiful, which is kind of historical understanding of what aesthetics are. But it's all these other things that are kind of involved in this idea of judging a neighborhood, which makes it such a kind of complicated site of judgment. So that's partly where Baldwin is there for me. This is a very messy answer, but I hear your question. It's very helpful, actually, for helping me think through some of this. Thank you. Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, I'm coming at this from the urban planning side, so Jane Jacobs, of course, is the mother god of everything. And I am really aware of the critique about her, not really engaging with blackness. But I wonder what your thoughts are about her approach to diversity. And so, of course, her fundamental concept in the book is diversity.
Yeah.
And that kind of, we don't understand when we do our city making, we haven't really understood how diversity is supposed to work. So could that be a way of almost sort of forgiving her inability to take on blackness specifically?
Yeah, and I really don't, I mean, this is making me think I need to rewrite this piece and be, because I don't want to throw out her project, like, definitely not. And I don't want to throw out her intentions, and even the kind of, again, like you were saying, that the work across that book is so different and distinct, and she's building something in a kind of idiosyncratic way that remains useful. There's a reason that book still remains vital today. I guess what I'm interested in is her own interest in the way that looking works to that project of diversity, right? Again, just from this frontispiece piece about this idea of this kind of self-conscious, or this idea of looking as this transparent act, right? This idea that we don't necessarily need to think about what it means to look, or this idea that looking itself is this kind of highly conditional process, right? And her interest in that tool to kind of illustrate these points that I think are valuable and useful, but the fact that this is the way that she kind of starts the book to get into it, right? Like, this is the way to counteract these kind of top-down planners who aren't actually going out and looking. Right. And her kind of interest in saying, well, if you just go out and look, this is the tool that's going to help us figure something out about how cities work. And I don't think she's wrong about that. But what I do think is interesting is the way that she then for that to be her argument, right? In some ways, she collapses what that looking is, or the kind of that the way that form of looking itself is a contested act, and the way that all these different actors in the same period are also talking about going out and looking as this vital act of community creation for the appraisers, right? But they're interested in economic value in looking, right? So the way that looking becomes instrumentalized by all of these different figures is what I'm interested in. And again, I don't necessarily then mean to kind of throw out everything she says because of this like one frontispiece, not at all. But even this question of what makes, how you look and read diversity in a neighborhood, right? Such a you know, the way that Brooks is suggesting that, you know, maybe looking at all isn't what's at stake here, right? Or the suggestion that one person's looking is not the same as another person. Like if we both went outside and looked at Chicago, right? The fact that we would have some sort of consensus about then how cities work is not true, right? It may be a valuable site of discussion where we would get somewhere, right? But this idea that looking is going to be the grounds on which you kind of know a city without kind of thinking about things.
I mean, she has a chapter in the book about cities as art.
Yeah.
Is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
You know, don't ever look at the city as an aesthetic project.
Yeah.
And it's all about what are the underlying processes involved. So in some ways, this opening paragraph is a paradox because it really is not about the position she's holding in the book. So I can see where that throws people off, actually.
Yeah. And again, this just goes back to what you're saying, that this book is such a funny animal. And I think on purpose, again, that she's producing all of these kind of different methods and modes and trying things on, that I don't want to, you're right, I don't want to like demonize her for trying these things out. But I do want to think about what the different ways that certain modes of looking and thinking emerge in the book, and when and why certain modes fall out, and when they're held together, and what's going on in these kind of different moments in the book. So I think you're totally right. Did you want to follow up on that?
Well, I was just saying how you situated it all just then, right? In response to planning, dealing with the sort of top-down gaze that she's trying to sort of reverse that, while at the same thing, starting from that point of saying like, okay, so top-down planners are doing this. I'm going to be the antidote. But then as she unpacks the book, and by the way, like I think I'm extremely critical of Jacobs, right? But as she unpacks the book, she's then reintroducing structure, right? And so she sort of starts out and she gets your attention by saying like, here's the different kind of observations, the different kind of gaze on the city, right? And then we can get back to it. And I think if you situate it in that way, then you deal with that otherwise like abstracted introduction of Jacobs into the chapter.
Yeah. Just one more question. I'm just thinking about the gender relation here, and in terms of, so the appraiser in the 20s, of course, would be a male, a white male, middle class appraiser. Yeah. And I'm just kind of wondering how you read this, and at the same time we've got this shift to a female consumer in the 50s, you know, that really gets solidified in the 50s, and so I'm just thinking about the act of appraisal, and then of course, especially for African American women who would be, you know, who are combating the Jezebel, I mean, they're always combating, you know, that kind of being appraised, right, by, within an urban context. So what do you kind of make of the woman? What do you make of the fact of the woman looking and appraising? And is that a different dynamic, and how much awareness is there of that? You know, being on the other side of the lens. You know, being on the other side of the gaze.
That's a really great question. And one I must say, I haven't thought too much. I mean, I have noticed that they're both women, and one of the ways I've tried to think about this is looking at some of the critiques of Jacobs in the period that were really kind of gendered, which some of you in the room may know better than me, but it's really gendered critiques of Jane Jacobs when she produces, when Death and Life comes out, you know, really attacking her as this kind of like, you know, dilettante mother.
The New Yorker review that is really, really condescending.
Right. And they're very gendered in their attack on her. You know, Brooks is interesting too, because so many of her works, I'm just thinking about something like Maud Martha or Annie Allen, they have kind of female protagonists who are going to look. I'm just thinking of this kind of fascinating scene in Maud Martha where has a beau who describes his relationship to going to the University of Chicago. This black boyfriend who's really, through him we get this very interesting map of what happens when you cross Cottage Grove, which was like the kind of dividing line at that time between Black Bronzeville and White Hyde Park. And his description of what it means to kind of experience those boundaries are so different from the way that the protagonist who's just listening, but we get all of her other modes of description in this period where he's kind of like, imagine himself loving White Hyde Park and really wants to immerse himself here, and kind of thinks about the dividing line as you cross the line and everything changes, and there's knowledge, and there's books, and there's Hegel. And Maud Martha just kind of listening to all of this, but then developing her own kind of practice of appraisal, which is really rooted in domestic spaces, in the home, and what it means to move around the home. Another amazing scene in this book book is where she's giving birth and all these kind of really horrific births, and she's screaming, and everyone in her kitchenette building can't help but hear her. And so there's this moment where all of the, where she's kind of mapping the space through the agony of her own birth and the way it's bringing all these people together. So I do think that they're interested in specific ways that that gender affects looking, particularly for Brooks. I don't know if I would say that about Jacobs, but it certainly affects the reception of the ways that they are perceived as women who are interested in this project of urban observation, which they both were certainly understood to be as women writers and women lookers in particular. That's the limit of my answer, but I'd love to think more about that. And if anyone has any other thoughts about that in particular, I would love to hear them. But that's a great question.
Well, just a little thought, but not very well articulated, but there's something about Jacobs kind of weaponizes the gaze in a way within the book, where it's also, I'm really interested, I mean, first of all, it's fascinating about things, but I was interested in how she basically, in the kind of correlation between what she's prescribing here as a way of knowing, but then also in the book, eyes on the street or like constant looking at the process is also how you're going to maintain a neighborhood in a way that you think it should function, right? And part of the problem then with top-down planning is that it doesn't allow people to continuously look and see, or continuously see. They should see, right? So there's these multiple, there's this other form of looking that is a kind of ongoing process.
Yeah, I'm also, I mean, the other thing that I'm trying to, I might put this into conversation with is, you know, the emergence of the Homeowners Association, which is also about certain modes of constant looking, right, but for different ends, right, and the ways, again, that this idea of looking itself as itself being any kind of singular solution is, you have in this period, again, all the different, I love this idea of weaponizing the gaze, right, in the ways that you have all these figures who are, again, interested in this mode of looking, both as a way to do all these different kinds of things that are often in direct conflict with one another. That, again, property and homeownership really then become a real mediating force in terms of deterrence. And, you know, the other thing that I would love to do with Jacobs that I haven't done is to really think about the ways she's, and those of you who have read the full thing more recently than I have for this piece, because this idea wasn't on my mind when I was looking at it, but the ways that homeownership shapes the way she's describing what it means to look or not look, right? Though she's dealing in urban spaces where this question of owning is different, but still increasing in this period, right? The way that the different kinds of stresses that private property puts on the need to look and the work of looking, that I think shapes what you're calling kind of this weaponized gaze, when you're kind of literally invested in the act of looking, right?
And you need to look at the same place over and over again in order to kind of guard it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
You don't know what's supposed to be there or not supposed to be there. So it's a kind of,
Right. And what it means to look for the health of the city versus its value, right? Its property value. And can you disentangle those, right? Which was kind of the question that was emerging in this period, right? If there is these financial, if the government is incentivizing segregation, which it was, subsidizing white residential segregation, which it was, how can you have a kind of a method of valuing heterogeneity against these intense pressures that the federal government was putting up to prevent those kinds of neighborhoods, right? And to really think about how these texts navigate that particular aspect of ownership is changing what it means to look, which is ultimately at the core of what I think this project will be, something that I want to keep track of.
I'm sorry.
Oh.
We're actually running over time, and I want everyone to have a chance to digest all this great information. So let's thank Adrienne.
Thank you so much. I've given this talk like a few times, and these are like the best questions I've gotten about this work. So I really appreciate